Arnold Schwarzenegger is not only a legend, he is a monument carved from iron, ambition, and impossible endurance. The Terminator made the world believe in the machine, Predator turned him into the face of fearless survival, and Total Recall sealed his place among the giants of Hollywood. For decades he seemed larger than life, a man built to conquer every stage he entered. But that brilliance was written in wounds, a cold childhood in Austria, years of rejection, a fractured family, painful medical chapters, and the lonely burden of aging inside a myth of invincibility. And now, in his late 70s, when many believe the battle is over, Arnold faces the quietest challenge of all, learning how to live as a man, not a monument. Before we begin, honor Arnold Schwarzenegger with a like, a tribute to the iron will that carried him home to his own humanity. Let us return to Austria, right after the Second World War. The year is 1947. We find ourselves in the small village of Thal, just outside of Graz. For a young Arnold Schwarzenegger, his childhood carried little of the warmth people imagine when they think of home. It was a hard, unforgiving place, where comfort was rare and everyday life was defined by what you did not have. You have to understand the quiet, heavy atmosphere of that environment to truly understand the man he became. The family home lacked modern plumbing, flushing toilets, and central heating to fight off the cold that settled deep into the valley during the long winter months. Physical warmth was scarce, and emotional warmth was perhaps even harder to find. His father, Gustav, was a stern local police chief who ran his household with the rigid expectations of a military man, believing entirely in discipline before tenderness. In that house, affection had to be earned, and even then it was distributed unevenly. Gustav made no secret of his favoritism toward Arnold's older brother, Meinhard. That left Arnold standing in the shadows of his own home. He was a boy constantly reaching for scraps of approval that almost never arrived, learning very early on what it felt like to be overlooked, to be secondary, to be virtually unseen. But loneliness has a strange way of acting like a forge. In that difficult silence, a quiet fire and a massive dream began to take shape. The turning point of his life happened the first time he walked into a modest weightlifting club in Graz and wrapped his young hands around a freezing, rusted iron barbell. That rusted piece of metal became his first true tool of escape. Imagine the smell of that old room. It lacked the bright lights and mirrors of modern facilities, offering instead the scent of damp concrete, cheap athletic chalk, and the stale sweat of working-class men pushing quietly against their limits. When Arnold first touched that cold iron knurling, it bit into his skin, waking something dormant deep inside his chest. He found a language that made sense to him. He realized in that exact moment that the iron was entirely honest. 200 pounds is always 200 pounds. The iron did not care where he came from. It did not care about the lack of heating in his house, his thick accent, or his father's clear preference for his brother. It only answered to effort. If you put in the grueling work, the iron gave you undeniable results. His father naturally mocked this obsession, telling him to do something useful like chop wood, dismissing the boy's dreams as a total waste of time. Every sneer and every dismissal pushed Arnold deeper into his relentless discipline. He lifted weights to meticulously lay the bricks for a physical and psychological fortress, so thick that nobody's harsh words or neglect could ever penetrate his soul again. He trained with a focus that was isolating, but absolutely necessary. When the cold numbed his fingers, he kept lifting. When his hands grew raw, he taped them carefully and returned to the bench. The deep muscle soreness he felt the next morning was never a deterrent. It was a comfort, the physical proof that the weakness and the insignificance were slowly leaving his body. He stared at the magazine cutouts of Reg Park, pinned to his bedroom wall as a young man studying a map to a different universe. Every heavy, gut-wrenching squat, where the bar bent across his shoulders, served as a direct refusal to accept a predetermined life of obscurity. He understood, far too young, that escape would have to be built with his own hands. He used the gym as a sanctuary, where he could control his own destiny. By choosing the absolute hardest physical path, enduring the repetitive strain of heavy lifting, he forged an armor that would protect him for the rest of his life. He transformed his deep-seated desire to be noticed into an unbreakable work ethic. Long before the world knew his name, Arnold had already won a private victory in the dampness of that local gym. He had learned to carry the heavy weight of his own future, and with every lift, the wounded boy from Thal moved one step closer to becoming impossible for the world to ignore. The human body always has its breaking point, yet the hunger to prove that you belong possesses absolutely no limits. When Arnold Schwarzenegger arrived in America in 1968 and began pushing toward the screen, there was no red carpet waiting to welcome him. In the weight room, he had already become a force the bodybuilding world could not ignore, a champion who had carved his own destiny out of pure iron. On a movie set, however, he was treated as a strange exception, a visual novelty that Hollywood simply did not yet know how to use. In many early meetings, the atmosphere must have felt heavy with skepticism. Casting agents and producers would look at his unprecedented frame and openly wonder whether his physique was simply too much for the screen. They heard his thick Austrian accent and seriously doubted whether American audiences would ever be able to accept it. To the establishment, he was a massive anomaly who did not fit the traditional mold of a leading man. Then came Hercules in New York, the very first feature film of his life, and the psychological wound delivered by the studio was quiet yet unmistakable. His voice was replaced, dubbed over completely by someone else. His family name was entirely removed from the movie poster. The man who had spent years in cold basements building his own identity piece by piece was presented to the world under the easier, smaller stage name Arnold Strong, as though the real Arnold Schwarzenegger was too foreign, too difficult, and too impossible to sell. For a man who had forged his entire existence through sheer willpower and relentless discipline, having his name and voice erased was a profound emotional hit. He absorbed that quiet humiliation the way a disciplined athlete absorbs a painful setback, without letting the world see how deeply it landed. You have to understand the gritty reality of those early days on set. Those moments were defined by small sets, modest productions, and unglamorous working days far removed from the shining fantasy of Hollywood. Moving his enormous, heavily muscled body for hours under hot lights demanded a different kind of endurance than lifting static weights in a gym. He had to learn how to move for the camera, how to fall safely, how to hold a mark, and how to repeat the same motion again and again until his body felt stiff from exhaustion. It was a blue-collar grind hidden behind the illusion of movie magic. Imagine the heavy scent of those early rehearsal rooms. It was the smell of burning stage lights, cheap rubber mats, stale coffee, and the intense sweat of a proud man desperately trying to learn an entirely new physical language. He was engaging in a long, quiet test of endurance. Looking back at this specific era, there is a heartbreaking yet beautiful purity to his daily struggle. He was an undisputed giant who chose to humble himself completely, willingly becoming a vulnerable beginner all over again, in an industry that had very little faith in him. Each day asked him to place his pride aside and begin again. He swallowed his immense pride. He accepted the small roles, awkward opportunities, and dismissive reviews without complaining. Underneath that calm exterior, he used rejection exactly the same way he used the heavy iron back in Graz. He used the mockery as resistance. He traded the safety and guaranteed applause of his bodybuilding championships for the loneliness and exhausting discipline of the rehearsal floor. He was learning, slowly and painfully, that Hollywood would never simply open its doors just because he had conquered the gym. He would have to earn every single inch of space in the frame, and with every rejection, every awkward role, and every quiet humiliation, Arnold moved closer to the day when the name they once tried to hide would become one of the most unforgettable names in movie history. There is a specific, intoxicating moment when an elite athlete finally stands beneath the championship lights and realizes the world is watching his every move. For Arnold Schwarzenegger, that defining moment arrived when he helped redefine the modern action hero on the big screen. The Terminator, Predator, and Total Recall turned his body, his stillness, his accent, and his discipline into a new cinematic language. He was no longer the awkward immigrant struggling to fit into the Hollywood mold. He had become one of the defining kings of the global box office. Whenever he stepped into the frame with that unmistakable presence, theaters around the world seemed to respond with awe to the myth of Arnold, a man who appeared carved out of living muscle, silence, and sheer will. But to truly understand the man and the private cost behind the entertainment he gave the world, you have to look past the roaring crowds and step into the quiet, lonely reality of the locker room. The movie magic often hides a profound physical and emotional truth. When the director finally yelled "cut" and the bright stage lights turned off, the grand illusion of the indestructible cyborg immediately faded into the reality of a hard-working athlete. The audience never saw what happened when the cameras stopped rolling. They never saw the dedicated champion sitting in silence after long shooting days, trying to quiet the aches that came with years of relentless physical demand. Living for decades as a symbol of physical power can leave a private toll on the body. Years later, Arnold would speak openly about shoulder surgery, a hip replacement, and the joint pain that can follow a lifetime of heavy training, reminding his devoted fans that even the strongest bodies still need care. Yet during his absolute peak, he rarely allowed fatigue to become part of the image. When millions of people pay hard-earned money to see you act like an unstoppable machine, a profound psychological weight begins to settle deep into your bones. The stronger the myth became, the less room there seemed to be for the mortal man inside it. The image left little room for weakness, it left little room for aging, it left little room for a tired human being who simply needed to rest. He pushed his limits with the stubborn endurance of a champion who had forgotten how to step back. We look back at those massive cinematic hits today with so much fond nostalgia, remembering the thrilling catchphrases and the iconic action sequences, but we rarely stop to appreciate the quiet physical cost he was carrying behind the image. Many physically demanding moments, many legendary poses, and every stoic look asked another measure of endurance from him. He was willingly trading the long-term ease of his own body to give us heroes that would live forever in our collective memories. It is a beautiful, deeply human kind of sacrifice. He built an unprecedented empire on the absolute myth of his own invincibility, carrying a heroic image that never seemed allowed to grow tired. The applause was completely real. The legacy was undeniably real. But so was the private cost of living, so long inside a public myth, reminding us that even the strongest heroes carry burdens the cheering crowd may never truly see. Every great champion eventually faces a moment of profound reckoning they do not see coming. For Arnold Schwarzenegger, the most devastating collapse of his life did not come from a failed blockbuster movie, a sudden drop in box office numbers, or a bitter political defeat under the harsh glare of the media. It came from inside his own home, originating from a deeply personal failure, with consequences he could no longer outrun or overpower. In 2011, just after he stepped away from his highly demanding years as the governor of California, the carefully built image of his perfect American dream abruptly broke apart. In a quiet, private confrontation that later became intensely public, he admitted a painful truth he had kept hidden in the shadows for over a decade. He confessed that he had fathered a son, Joseph, with Mildred Baena, a longtime member of the household staff. The revelation deeply wounded a marriage that had lasted 25 years and fundamentally changed the emotional landscape of his family forever. It would be incredibly easy for the outside world to look at this moment only through the shallow lens of headlines and tabloid noise, but the deeper story is far more